Brendan, have I got the
All
right
right,
one up?
you've got it. Yeah, so our first session this morning is going to be about this idea of WE data, but using it outside the classroom. We're interested in ways that we can take our dots and go beyond just what's on our dashboards and what's within the tool and start to use the index in sort of wider and different ways. So we've got two main ways that we're going to be talking about that this morning. Rob, if you could advance through, and those will be referenced in our breakout sessions as well. So in our first session, we'll be talking about benchmarking engagement between like schools and trying to look at what engagement looks like across schools and then sharing that data with participating schools so they can see where they stand. And then secondly, the idea of alternative grids, which John touched on, which Rob will go into a lot more detail on later on. So again, if you have an idea that one of these breakout sessions is just perfect for you, if you could go ahead and put that in the chat, that'd be great. But we'll do a quick intro as well of each of these so that you can get a better idea if you're not sure where you'd like to go.
And then if you see Brendan's face look haywire, it's because he's trying to figure out how to put people in our two rooms. So just a word here is that the, we think that engagement data has been really useful, but it was when we developed this work, it was for one particular purpose, and that purpose was for schools to do internal improvement. So really specifically, we wanted to be able to get a lot of data about students. We particularly wanted to be able to find those who might be in significant trouble, but we also are happy to find the ones who were high flyers in terms of engagement. It has always been part of our charge that this work would be useful to faculty members. Actionable data, and we have many schools that have done great jobs with that. And then my initial interest when I was head of school was the ability at the sort of 30,000 foot level to be able to find strengths and challenges within our engagement constellation, but very much focused on internally on schools being able to improve themselves. Since then, we've really thought about some other pieces, and this first piece that Brian is going to be talking with us about really is benchmarking engagement. Brendan?
Yeah, so one of the cool things that we've been starting to see as more and more schools are using the engagement index is that we're starting to get both a lot of schools, but that a lot of schools that are also sort of clustered in a lot of places. For instance, we have 4 in North Dakota, we have a bunch in Ohio, there's East programs all over Arkansas. And so being able to have all of these places where we have large numbers of similar schools has started to open this door to what would it look like if we were going to actually start comparing schools to one another. One of the biggest questions we often get is, are my dots good? Is 20% grind good? Is it bad? And while it's hard to have an answer for that, if we have collections of schools that are going to work together to benchmark and share engagement data, then we might be able to get to some of those schools, or to some of those questions, I should say. So if you could go ahead, Rob. Yeah, so we're basically trying to ask this question, is what we see in our school, something that everybody sees, or is it unique to us? Is it standard that science is more engaging than math, or is that just something that's unique to us? So what we've been thinking about is how different consortia of schools that are similar could work together to pool their data and then get that aggregated, anonymized data shared back amongst them so that everybody can see where their programs stand in comparison to their peers. And trying to be more specific about, is what I see in my school typical or not? So with that, we have a lot of different ways we can actually analyze the data and look at it that we're still thinking about and trying to work on. Some of it could be numeric, some of it could be graphical. We have some examples of that on the next slide. So we can see lots of different ways that we would use this. We have the wall of numbers approach on the left. We have some nice graphics on the right. But part of this whole thing is, what would this sort of comparison reporting even look like? How would we look at this? So that leads us to a lot of different questions that we might have about this idea of benchmarking. Firstly is just, how valid are these comparisons? If schools are taking dots at different times of day or different days of the week or different times throughout the year, if teachers are sharing the tool with students in different ways and explaining how to do the tool in different ways. Does it make sense to make these sort of comparisons, or are they flawed right from the get-go? So we certainly think that the data we have shows that it is comparable, but if we standardize this and put it across 20 schools, then this would be something we'd have to consider and have to figure out. Then another question is just, once a school has this data available, they know that their science department is in the 75th percentile of engagement, but their language arts department is in the 25th percentile. How can a school actually constructively use that feedback, that data, to improve instruction? Like, if I know that students are telling me they have low Lovett in PE, then I know that we need to find ways of increasing the Lovett score, and we can start working with the teacher and with students to figure out how to do that. But if I know that my PE Lovett is in the 30th percentile, it's a little less clear how that would be useful. So that's just a thing that we'd want to think about as well. And then finally, and this can be something for the breakout session, what would you want to actually know from a benchmarking report like this? And that's a question I would ask everyone here. What is something that we would actually want shared there? So when we break out, we'll be in a session led by Brian Thomas. He's currently the assistant head of school at MICDS, and will soon be the head of school at Proctor Academy. And he's actually been one of the leaders in a project we're doing where we are benchmarking 6th grade math departments across a group of independent schools who are interested in this sort of pilot. So he's the guy to talk to for this, because he's one of the folks who have started this new project. So really excited to have him join us.
I'll be leading another group, but Brian is, I think, far more suave and interesting, so I'll understand if that's where you go. But when we started with this work, we had a number of schools that asked us, could they change the quadrants, the definers of the axes, and we were doggedly uninterested in doing that. And we had some very particular reasons for that, one of which was we did have this dream at some point of having 70, 100, however many schools actually looking at each other's data, benchmarking, and if everybody had a different set of quadrants, that would absolutely make it impossible for us to do the kind of comparative work or the kind of trend work that we wanted to do. And we have at various points shared with many of you trends that we have seen, particularly in times of COVID in this past year. But we have, we've really actually, and it started with MICDS in St. Louis was the first to say, we really want a different quadrant. And then they said the magic thing, to go along with the data we're doing on the engagement grid. So they wanted to do an additional, and we said, we got to work on that for an additional, not a replacement, but an additional. So we started to play with that. And I think it's a fairly simple process and can be used not just with students, but can be used with a bunch of other groups. And we're going to talk about the first example in my breakout will be a school that wanted to do some analysis of its board. And wanted a quadrant for that purpose. But again, it's simply the notion of being able to identify what it is you want to be measured. And of course, you have to fall in love with the quadrant system for whatever measurement you're doing. And then ask people to complete the dots in just the same way that the students do. One of the great things that we're looking for is there a quadrant system that teachers can give a dot for their students, and one where teachers could give a dot for their supervisors, which we think would, where teachers are question, another tool that could be evaluative of them to be able to use it in different directions. And then at present, it requires us to send you the data once you've collected it. But as John mentioned earlier, we're really working for to get to the point where that's just available to you as the engagement data is already available to you. So basically, this is a new ball game that we're really enjoying playing with. So I am going to lead that conversation. That's what we're going to do as we get into our groups. What we're going to do is go into our 2 separate rooms, and the notion here is, and it's always been the notion with this gathering, is that we want folks to share. This isn't just about Brian and Rob Brisk telling you what they think. We'll do a little introduction, but we're really interested in a conversation. Having said that, I think I need to know from Brendan how close we are to being able to split people into groups.
Yeah, so if we haven't, just put in chat which session you'd like to join. That would be helpful. We're at about halfway there, so I'm sure we'll get them all in next minute or so.
So I think what we'll do is we'll take if people need a very quick break, we'll take a 3-minute break right now, but please put yourself into, or tell Brendan which of and the choice here again is, let me go back to, does that help? And the choice is one of those 2 experiences, and it is, by my watch, 9:36, and we'll pick up at 9:40. There. Stan, you win. You are America's greatest. I appreciate it. So for those of you who are watching this by recording, I had forgotten to record, and you missed a minute or 2 of scintillating conversation. So we'll go back to our sharing moment here. And so I was working with a school with a very experienced head, whose board of, and this was a board of trustees as opposed to a board of education, deferred to her on almost every issue because she'd been the head for 30 years and they had been on the board for a year or 2. So we developed the, this, does that look familiar to everyone? So we developed the y-axis as supportive, unsupportive, and the x-axis as proactive and reactive. And then the name of this game is that if you make the quadrant, then you have to make names for each of the 4 areas. So supportive and proactive, we called creative. Generative, productive, ambitious were the words that we described that. The second one, supportive and reactive, we called responsive. Does this make sense to people? Give me a thumbs up if this makes some sense to you. Yeah. And we then got to the places where we who've run schools don't want boards to be. We called the unsupportive reactive, knee-jerk. And I added the word lurking because that, that's the way that feels sometimes. And then what I think is probably the worst of the group, unsupportive proactive, undermining. So I was, and this is just anecdotal, I was just talking to people who run schools, both board chairs and heads of schools. What I found was that boards wanted to be strongly here, and heads of school really wanted them more kind of here, which had to do with some degree of the degree to which heads want to run their schools, and sometimes boards want to run their heads. So we just thought sort of interesting stuff. And then, the path, I worked with a head for years who had a board that started here and then worked their way around to there, which is not, over a period of maybe 6 or 7 years, which is not really what you want to do. Anyway, so when we were working with this board, we said, where are you? And they put in their dots, and they were entirely over here. And then we did another session, said, where do you think you should be? And they moved somewhere over here. And then we asked the head of school, who was in the call as well, where she'd like them, and she put them right about, she'd like them to be there. So again, just a method of being able to do some interesting work. This work comes to us from Fargo, North Fargo. Excuse me, West Fargo, and they were interested in how their faculty felt in a faculty meeting. And they were particularly, and they had everybody put in 3 dots because there were 3 parts of the meeting. and they wanted to know the whole group, the breakout, and the share out. And so their gridler was heard and unheard on the y-axis, and valued, and your faces are in the way. Is it unvalued? So yeah, unvalued. So if you're valued and heard, they came up with trust. You're trusted as a faculty. How about if you're heard but unvalued? Any thoughts? How about unheard and unvalued?
Invisible.
Ignored. So invisible.
And unheard and valued? You're valued, but nobody listens to you, so taken for granted. So and what they found was that the different parts of their meeting worked quite differently. So where were we? The breakout discussion was the most heard, most valued piece of the meeting, where they felt most heard and most valued. And the share out was the least, which is generally the way I think share outs work. So so what else could we measure? And here we've got about 10 minutes left in our session here. And we thought we'd just like to play a little bit with this. So one of the things I had mentioned earlier was, are there, could you do a gridler for how teachers assess their supervisors in their supervision capacity? And if so, what would that look like? And would that be of value? And as a person who used to supervise people, I sort of think that might actually be of value. What would that look like? Thoughts?
It might not be dissimilar to the grid you just showed us.
For the board?
No, for peers.
Right. Okay. Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah. This one?
Right. For our faculty, being heard is
Right.
huge.
Right. Uh-huh.
So.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I think it follows that same thing. We hear a lot of these themes of, am I valued? Am I heard? That trust issue. I think getting opportunities to get some feedback. I like the idea of doing it after different sessions or kind of events with the faculty.
Right.
But I think even them being able to share that and know that they got to drag a dot, that little bit of empowerment, I think could be really interesting.
So Jeff, let me ask you this question. If you were to do a thing like this and have, and have your folks put a dot for you, would you then share it with those folks?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask where that dot would be, because obviously it would be in that nested quadrant, Rob. Yeah, I think that would be the piece. It would the visibility of the data and transparency, because that's the other piece we hear a lot about from faculty, right? So I think you would need to back out and have it unfiltered, and then kind of frame what the reflection is and how you're using it. But I think that would be an important piece. Otherwise, it's behind that curtain and just tell them, dots look great, thanks.
Yeah, and you gave me some, and I thank you for it. And let's move on.
Yeah, one thing I'm curious about is when this was used, how many dots did show up in the discounted or taken for granted quadrants, just because I think it requires a tremendous amount of self-awareness to be able to distinguish between being heard and being valued. Like, I'm trying to think, like, when are some moments in my own experience when I've been like, yeah, they heard me, but I don't feel valued. Like, or you know what? I feel super valued by this community, but nobody hears what I have to say.
Yeah.
Like that, I feel like I'm able to make that observation about other people.
Right.
But that's like, it seems like this is like blind spot city over here.
Yeah, and one of the issues as you build gridlers is, I mean, it seems to me that, challenged and love it are two things, I mean, are intuitively fairly obvious, I think, to people, which is why we think that really works. One of the issues in developing a good gridler is it has to be something that actually resonates with you and makes sense, right? That you can identify reasonably easily, right?
And
So,
these may co-vary in this one because I know I'm valued because I'm heard. Like the two axes may actually be a little too linked, and maybe there's another element of that faculty experience that could be on that other axis. Because I think
that's a great point.
Yeah.
That was a really good point.
Yeah. One gridler that a school offered up, we did for them, but we couldn't figure, they were so intertwined that we couldn't figure out how, there were two parts of the quadrant we couldn't figure out how you could be in. And I think they discovered that too after a while. Let me just ask this one. If we were to run this one for you to use this quadrant for a teacher talking about his or her supervisors, would that be of any use? And I think the descriptors might be different, but have you worked for people who are proactive and supportive? Have you worked for people who are reactive and support? I mean, are these, would that be data that would be useful? And that, Stan, you teach. What do you think?
I like them both. Where I'm at with my leadership team, and how my kids can use this information to move them into that creative aspect.
Mm-hmm.
But I see kids in all four quadrants in my class.
Right. If you had the chance, you're supervised. If you had the chance to use this for your supervisor, would that be data you'd want to give?
I would love to.
Yeah.
But would they want to see it?
Well, it's, one of the things that we've been talking about is that if in fact we're getting this data about teachers, wouldn't it be best practices for administrators to get this data about themselves from the folks they work with?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
They evaluate me, but I never evaluate them.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And it needs to go. To have true value, it needs to go both directions. Right.
So the other question I wanted to ask, and we have just a couple more minutes left, is one of the things that actually has been quite fascinating is that whenever we've looked at it, teachers don't particularly know where their students fall on the engagement grid. And we played early on with the notion of asking teachers to put a dot for students on the engagement grid. But quite frankly, teachers don't generally, teachers are not nearly as good as they think they might be in knowing whether their kids feel challenged and love it. And the thing that we found most, just sort of anecdotally, was, or the couple of times we waded into this, was that teachers assumed that any student who raised a hand a lot, smiled, and got the right answers was engaged. And that what we found in a couple of very small studies was that a lot of those students were either entertained, unchallenged and love it, or bored. So we've always been thinking about, is there a gridler for teachers that would be interesting to note, that in which they would put a dot in for their students? And then it might.
Hey, Rob.
Yeah.
This gets me thinking about the willing learner metric, where we had those subjective measures, sort of the student's approach, and when we had the students sort of gauge themselves and the teacher scored them, and we called that the fantasy gap, where especially boys were very different.
Hey Jeff, would you explain the willing learner metric?
Yeah, so we tried to capture data from colleges that sort of measured readiness, the attributes of students and success in college, and then worked backwards to see if we were giving students feedback about that. And about half of that was skills and content based, but the other half was more about effort, approach, mindset. And so we created a what we call the willing learner metric, where teachers just subjectively scored their students along this gradient from basically disengaged, distracting, all the way up to voracious. And then we had the students score themselves where they thought they were in those classes. And oftentimes the boys scored themselves higher than what the teachers were giving themselves. And sometimes the girls were flipped the other direction. And so just reflecting on that and their approach to learning, we found really effective. It doesn't show up on the transcript or their grades, but it was just that piece of, to the earlier point around self-awareness, like what are you bringing to the table and what is the teacher seeing in you? So I think you could see a similar disconnect from what the teachers think's going on in their classroom, what the students report.
Hey, Jeff, do you think, do you have a written description of that we could make available to our attendees somewhere?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
that'd be great, because I think it's a really interesting piece of work that you all are doing. So
yeah, I'll pull that together.
Okay, other thoughts about how one might have a teachers fill in dots for their students?
I love the idea, even though, I mean, we always assume where our kids are going to be. The question always comes to me is, are my kids lying to me? When they put their dot, are they just put the dot knowing I can't see it, which we had that argument already. But are they putting theirs where they truly belong?
And really the underlying question, Stan, is can you really be as good as your students say you are?
Right.
So, yeah. And would it be interesting actually to do a study of teachers put a dot for their students and then actually on the same grid that the students use, and then look at the difference?
The only question on that one, would we know who that student is? Would know who that student is then? Or that would just be a random?
Well, that's of course a good question, and we're not far enough along to figure out quite
Right.
how we would manage that. But yes, would it be a bad thing for individual teachers to know? You'd have to know where their student put the dot to know how far they were from the dot that the teacher put for the student.
I'll do that for you.
Well, I love it.
And what would a teacher, if in reality, really say? You know what? I think they're all bored.
Yeah,
their own dot there.
I've certainly,
because we also have that piece with the students, right? Am I
Yeah.
going to say I'm entertained?
Yeah.
Because the risk is then the teacher's going to ramp up that challenge. So
okay, we're going to be bounced.
Myself in that.
We're going to be bounced in 5 seconds. Would each of you say a word about what happened in this session?
Awesome.
Yeah, just a thing, if you can say a thing. And what is this saying? I think it's saying leave. Oh no, we have 50 seconds. Jeff, I'm sorry. We have 50 more seconds. Suzanne, you look frazzled. I'm sorry. Oh, you've muted somehow. All right. Sorry. So
this is interesting. It's what it is. I'm really interested.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're interested, and that should be a grid. So we're gonna, in 27 seconds, we're gonna be bounced back. I thought that the bounce back warning was actually the end of it, which is why I interrupted. I'm sorry to do that. We actually have 15 more seconds for a final word, but if each of you would say a word, perhaps of a thing that you heard in here that was worth sharing, that would be great. And then I won't do the summing up because they'll hear enough from me. Okay, bye-bye.
Let everybody get into the room. And thank you very much for showing your faces. It's good to see everybody here. So a couple of years ago, I was at a conference for index schools. Index schools are a group or consortium of schools around the country, large independent schools. And independent means that we have our own board. We're not tied to a diocese or some other philosophy. We have our own philosophy, and our board tend to be self-perpetuating, meaning they select from inside, they're not elected. And we were all meeting in Chicago, and I said, hey, there's this great new tool. This is 2018, I believe, so it was a while ago. Great new tool. Would love to have some of you come in with me on this, because they were just our size. We are 1,250 kids, so a very small school if you're coming from a very large district, but for independent schools, it's a big school. And we're also sort of in one place, one facility, junior kindergarten, so 4-year-olds all the way through 12th grade. And at that point, crickets. Nobody said anything. You know, like when you think, well, maybe I'm just ahead of my time, but I wasn't. But people were very fascinated and interested in what Wellington would do or could do. And unless you experienced it yourself, it's very difficult to see and understand the kinds of things that you would want to compare. I wanted to compare student engagement because I thought that student engagement was the, if you know that saying, I think it's Plutarch or Aristotle, depending on whose slide it is, that a mind is not a, what is it? A mind is not a pail to be filled, but a fire to be lit, right? So engagement is the lighting of the fire, really trying to see where it happens and if kids could measure themselves on it. And it got me to thinking about this first question, and we're going to open it up to everybody to talk at this point. If you could introduce yourselves. The first question, if you recall, is how valid do you think comparisons are across schools? Because I think that was the question maybe that many of the people in that room, and we were in real time, so pre-COVID, had, like, how valid is comparing something amorphous that wasn't a test score across different schools? So if you could unmute yourselves and let's begin to have at least a discussion maybe around that question, that topic, it would be great. So why don't we start with Rinda?
There. So I'm Rinda. I'm a program coordinator with the East Initiative, and right now we have had 17 schools this past year working with Wellington just to look specifically at our elective program that we offer K through 12, and it could be put in any school. So we wanted to use this, and we'll talk more about this later today, to really fuel a PLC and to really challenge our facilitators to be reflective and see how much they could challenge their kids and how they could grow them, because that is the heart of what we do. So comparison across schools, I will say for Arkansas is it's difficult to try and do because we have very rural schools that are taking part, and we also have what we consider in Arkansas metropolitan. Not so metropolitan to some of you, but to us. Bigger schools, smaller schools, whatever. We have facilitators that have multiple duties, some that are purely focused on just our elective. So we have this strange balance of things happening. But at the same time, we're seeing by and large similar scores for our engagement ratings for our facilitators. So while everybody wants to make an excuse of my school is different or my community is different, it's amazing the similarities that we're seeing. So that's why I wanted to sit in on this and hear kind of other people's perspectives on it as well.
Well, it's interesting too, because when we were working with you, Rinda, while we had a lot of different school situations and settings and all over the state, we did have students placing dots all around the same week, right? It was all very similar times, and then in the similar type class, it was all an East class. So that was a question that I was having in my head was, if one school does it 4 times a year and one does it 8 times a year and at different times of day, does that mean it's about the same? And while in the East program, I'm sure they're not all exactly the same type or time of day, but they're the same days or the same weeks at least. So I feel like that was a really interesting input that could have led to the dots being, like you said, most of them were very close.
The thing we noticed too was a correlation between our class and other disciplines. We just used generic disciplines in our case because we were going across schools, and our organization wanted to see the data, so we kind of worked like the district for it. So yeah, it's been very interesting because there's been big correlations between how engaged students are in our class and the other ones that they're also involved in. So
love to get some thank you so much for that, Brenda. That was great. And it's really helpful to say that you're seeing similar data across schools. So I'm interested to see if anybody else has any questions about validity, because I certainly had some questions about that, but I would love to hear any other questions.
I can go if that's okay. I'm Ralph Marshall. I teach in a small independent school. I'm the Dean of Faculty here in Louisville. The name of the school is St. Francis. And I understand that probably that you do see similar data across categories, but my question would be, with similar data, we can still have very different interpretations of that data according to the categories or missions of whatever that school is. And I think without taking those categories and mission statements into account, the similarities can be misleading because interpretation and hard data are not necessarily one-to-one in terms of their understanding what these are. Sorry for the birds.
Oh, it's lovely. I love it.
So that would be my main concern. That the it's sort of like looking at quantitative versus qualitative. I think you need some of that qualitative in there to give meaning to the quantitative data, and that's sort of where I come down on it. And that's not having really explored the tools. I'll be upfront about that, and seeing how you might use those comparisons effectively. But I feel like it's just my sort of instinct to be a little bit skeptical about raw data without giving it some framework where you can find meaning from interpreting it. So that's it.
Well, one of the things that we know, Ralph and everybody else, thank you so much for that, your reflection on that. One of the things that we know is that kids, depending on the school type, we know that sort of really good engagement is around 60 to 63%. And in other types of schools, or even in middle schools, it's a little lower. The more sort of compulsory and the less choice kids have, the less engaging it is for them. So that's what we know. I want to pull any other voices and folks in on this question. If you have any thoughts about it, how valid is benchmarking across schools? Would you think, Jill or Carmen or Connie?
Hi, I'm Carmen, and I'm in Arkansas. I'm an East teacher. I teach 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And to me, looking at the data across schools, which we were able to kind of see what other East programs were doing in our state, it's looking at grade level by grade level. My engagement fell off. Like 4th grade was consistently scored more engaged than 5th, which scored more engaged than 6th. And I had a conversation with my students. We had a round table, and I said, okay, guys, here's 4th, here's 5th, here's 6th. What do you think? Why is 6th less engaged than 4th? And they had some really good ideas. So I think being able to, show that cross-school data and say, okay, well, here's an average of all 4th graders that collected dots. Here's an average of all, and it showed the same pretty much, you know, our trend was the same as everybody else who did the dots in the state. And the kids, you know, they said, well, maybe because fourth grade we're new, and, you know, this is our first year, so we're more engaged because we're learning more. It's more challenging than it is as it goes along, which I don't necessarily agree with, but they had some really good ideas about why the trends were what they were. So I think, you know, cross school, being able to see what other schools' data is, I think it's very helpful.
And note what Carmen said is that she had the students into conversation. So that's the sort of the piece, is that you are really actively involving kids in the discussion about what engagement is and what engagement looks like. Jill or Connie?
Hi, y'all. I'm Connie Chambers. I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning at Savannah Christian Prep in Savannah, Georgia. I love data. And so for us to be able to compare to other independent schools and just pull out what is important to us, I hate to sound selfish, but you know, we compare test data. We take the ERB and the CTB5 and we compare ourselves to other independent schools. We compare, I mean, it's kind of in all the data that we use. And it's, to us, just another tool, I think, is how we would look at it. But I think it would be fascinating to know where we how we compare to the other schools. We haven't even gotten to the point of asking the kids, and Carmen, that was fantastic, asking them what those trends look like and why it would look that way. I think I would love to do that. We had just begun to really focus on student engagement, and then COVID. So for us, it kind of threw everything behind, I guess, like everyone else. We're no different than anyone else. So I think as we begin to recover, I think that would be a great place to start is, you know, when we first do it in the fall, maybe, okay, guys, this is what we're looking at, and, you know, give us some feedback as to why. I'm not sure that we did enough teacher training and teacher reflection, to be honest, before COVID, to really get into the nitty gritty about why they thought, you know, what they saw and why they thought that was happening, things like that. I think we had only done it 1 year, so we were kind of new to the game. And then I think we were still with a lot of teachers in that, oh, why do my numbers look like this? Why do I have bad dots? Things like that. And so we needed to work through that a little bit more before we kind of branch out into the kids. But I think we're getting there. So I think this year would be that year to do that. Start with a lot of reflection and then student reflection as well. So Carmen, I really appreciate that. That was an awesome idea.
It's a great idea. Jill, wanted to leave any time for you if there's anything that you wanted to add.
I'm Jill Webb. I'm the Director of Professional Development for ISACS, which is our accrediting body for the independent schools in the Midwest. I'm just leaving my position as head of the lower school at Wellington School. So we've been around since the birth of the quadrant. I think it's really helpful to benchmark because so many, and I'm looking mostly at independent schools, their numbers are small, and I think it's easy to explain away some of the data because you start attaching a dot to a particular child and or a particular teacher, which in some cases might be helpful, but also what Carmen said, looking at engagement across grade levels with bigger numbers, grades 4 to 5 to 6. So I think being able to do both, you can look at your own dots, but then to be able to benchmark against other schools and say, gosh, if you are the oldest grade in a division, you might expect the numbers to reflect some boredom with, you know, being in lower school for 7 years, that's normal, or it's not. And, but also to be able to look at your own dots in your own institution. So I don't see that there's always variables internally and externally. I see it only a plus to compare and contrast with a larger pool.
Thank you for that, Jill. And that's really helpful, because I think what you're saying is really the internal reflection is probably more important than anything else, but being able to look across schools at what engagement might be. And especially if you're doubling down on the student, I mean, that's what you're doing. You're doubling down on the student experience is really helpful. Some of us have surfaced the ideas about flaws in the benchmarking. And John, I didn't forget you at all, by the way. If there's anything that you wanted to add to that last topic, I would love it, because you're seeing it across places. Is there anything you wanted to add?
The one point I would like to make is that we've gone from day one thinking that this data won't tell us anything, and then we've let the data up.
Yeah, John, you're a little quiet. Yeah.
Sorry, I took off my headphones. We've always, from day one, thought that the data is not going to tell us anything. That's how we've approached it. And then we've let the data reveal itself to us that it is in fact valid. And although we haven't had the ability to do that on a big picture, we've done a lot of analysis of Wellington's data and find that, like, even when we, for example, we replace a teacher between 2017, 2018, but the curriculum stays the same. And the students who are completely separate set going through that 9th grade curriculum put their dots in the same spots that they did before. So you go, there's validity there. There's something that students can innately tell us about their experience that is perhaps not tied to a bigger picture or whatever. It's tied to their experience. So I think we've learned a lot that the data is innately valid because it tends to trend a certain way. And I think some of those big trends might very well appear across schools as well. Like, several years ago, there was that famous book written about teaching girls in schools. And it was kind of a global event of saying that we don't teach female students as well as males in the classroom. Well, that's a comparison across many schools with many different environments, with many different populations, and it's still a valid point. So I think we are on the right track here. That's all I wanted to throw in there. So,
appropriate to that point, John, I talked to a researcher here in St. Louis at Washington University in St. Louis, just about happiness scores. It's pretty simple. I mean, just like I think the most elegant sort of ways to measure things are pretty simple. And basically the happiness experts, they score like on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest. How happy are you? And people in that moment in time, if they say, well, I think I'm more like a 7, it is comparable across cultures even. So people have a sense of what that looks like, what that feels like to them. And I think the Wellington dots do the same thing, really, depending on where you are. We see, at least across our school too, places where it's in really low, in the low 50s and sometimes higher. So so we got to that one question, but we've covered a lot.
Yeah, I think we might need to make the next breakouts a little longer. Didn't realize.
I think so. Any last parting thoughts from anybody here? I want to leave it up to you all to see if there's anything else that you wanted to kind of bring out in terms of this topic.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in. Oh, go ahead, Rinda.
Well, I was just going to say, I would be really curious in seeing if there's trends across all of the schools who are using Wellington, not just within my pocket or within your pocket or, whatever. I would really be interested in seeing that, because we've watched some really cool stuff this year, and I'm excited about doing it again next year to see if we get the same results.
More choice, more voice.
Rob, I think we might need to make the next ones a little longer. We were going strong and then got kicked out.
We spoke for about 2 minutes and then nobody had anything else to say. It was okay. No, I'm kidding. We used our full time too, and it's nice to see, Brian, that you seem to have survived it. So And again, thank you, Brian, for participating in this way. We'd like to take a couple of minutes just to do a little bit of recap of what we heard in the sessions. And so we'd invite folks to say a word or two about what you heard in your session. And shall we start with, Brendan, which session shall we start with a recap of? You pick.
Let's get you out of the way so we can save the best for last.
Okay, thank you very much, Brendan, you're fired. All right, so I've prepped our group to say a word or two about what we heard in the work that we did. So I'm going to stop talking.
Well, I just thought it was really interesting to think about different ways to provide feedback in sort of different directions. So students to teachers, teachers to students, teachers to their supervisors, and then sort of bigger picture school culture things. But all you need to do is boil it down to the two characteristics that add up to whatever it is that you're looking for the feedback about, which is harder than it looks.
And I'll add a thing that didn't actually come up in this session, but in these brief moments, or 60 seconds that we had to ponder, the idea of actually trying to create those two axes, and what are those things that matter if a faculty member was going to give feedback to a supervisor? How would you designate those? And I think that process, partnering with faculty to figure out what those things are, could be as effective as the actual tool itself, just a greater awareness of what matters to people.
I agree with both those things. And what I thought was fascinating too is that it never occurred to me that this was something that Wellington offered, that you could do this. And it would be so actionable because it could be so quickly measurable.
My take back from a student standpoint is, how can I have my students use this new tool to become more engaged? And that's where my mind's working. And Rob and Brendan know they're going to be hearing from Caitlin here before long. So I'm excited to see how this may work out to better the students.
And Stan has actually done some fascinating work on that with his students, which he'll be talking about in our third session today. So I think that's a really good recap of some of the work that we're doing. And we recorded, except for the first 2 minutes when Stan reminded me to record. So you can get back to it later. So Brendan, I think that's us.
Great. And I think we recorded as well, but I guess we'll find out at the end, huh? But yeah, Brian, love to have you take us away.
Yeah, I want to do the same thing. I want to turn it over to the people who were in the session rather than having me, really sort of recap for us. Just things, big takeaways that people had, and whoever would like to start, please do.
I think it was interesting thinking about the ways in which we'd have to structure these sort of benchmarking setups so that we're looking at similar populations or similar schools, with some concerns about are dots going to be valid to compare between schools all over the country. It seems like it would be a really important thing to ensure that we're looking at, just rural public schools with 200 to 500 students or something like that. So we can try to more closely approximate what dots would look like. And that's because we've seen, successful benchmarking sorts of work with Rinda's group in East. And, we're just interested to see how that could be applied elsewhere.
And Rinda did have something to say.
Yeah.
I was going to say my big takeaway, and I loved, this was like music to my ears to hear, but for someone to say, we're comparing ourselves anyway. We're doing it through testing and everything else, whether we're an independent school, a public school, whatever. Why not compare engagement? And to me, that was music to my ears, because I don't believe in testing.
I can say something. the idea of how we use trends that we recognize within the data, I think that is an important discussion to have, and I think I appreciated all the information that was provided in the group for those who have really been using the system, and it was very helpful for me to hear those things.
We didn't get to,
go ahead, Jill. I'm sorry.
Sorry, we didn't get to this in our session, but I am continuously looking through the lens of professional development and how interesting to use your engagement data then to drive your professional development, as you can identify pockets institutionally or through subject areas or divisions that can tie directly to your institutional goals and drive your professional development for a long period of time.
That's great. And Carmen had something interesting. Carmen?
I was going to kind of piggyback on the PLCs. With East, we were meeting together after we did a dot collection and discussing it and talking about, why do you think this is or why? And I think it to me, as a professional, as a facilitator, that is far and above, better than any PD you can have at school that's on social studies or math or science or whatever. When you start really looking at how are kids engaged and why are they engaged. I had my students look at their scores and their dots compared to other East program dots to the same grade level. And we talked about trends with them, and they're 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. So they're little kids. We're not talking about, high school kids. We're talking about little people, and they had some really great ideas about why the dots are placed where they are in all subject areas, not just East. So I think, that benchmark across grade levels and across schools, I think it would be helpful. I think even comparing, I'm in a very, very small school. We have about probably less than 1,000 students, K-12. So very small school. But I'd like to compare my scores to a huge school in Chicago or wherever. I'd like to see the difference in how engaged my kids are compared to students in larger schools. So I don't know, I think, and of course, with all data, there's always that you have to take that with that grain of salt, how does it compare and why does it compare that way? But I think it would be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. And just wanted to say that in our 3rd session, Rinda will be leading a discussion, and Rinda's really done some great work with PLCs in Arkansas. And Stan is going to be talking about how you use data with students to get students to drive this perspective. So those are two, I think, both related to what Carmen's talking about, and I think super interesting stuff.
I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay.